Time for us to get started. For those of you who have not yet quite attained my age in life, a little bit of information that may help you in coming years. These are some things to help you know when you're getting older. You're sitting on a park bench one day and a Boy Scout comes up to help you cross your legs. Your insurance company sends you their calendar 1 month at a time. You've noticed that gelatin desserts are a lot tougher to chew than they were before. You have more options on your bed than you do in your car. You have a remote for your bed? I do. That thing does everything. That's crazy. It takes a couple of tries to get over speed bumps. One of the throw pillows that you have on your divan is a hot water bottle. You discover the words whippersnapper, scallywag, and bicracky have begun to creep back into your vocabulary. You hear yourself saying, "Why, I remember when," more than 3 times a day. You run out of breath walking down a flight of stairs. You look both ways before you cross the room. You discover that it's easier to get older than it is to get wiser. A couple of weeks ago, I was kind of fixated on this Psalm 56 and 8 and showed you some AI-generated pictures and a poem and talked about putting it to music. So I'm not a musician, so I thought I'd ask my friends at AI to see if they could do it for me, and this is what I came up with.
You see me in the shadows when the night is closing in. You hold the weight of sorrow and call me by my name again. Not a moment goes unnoticed. Not a cry falls to the ground. You've written down my story, and your mercy covers now. Every tear in your bottle, every cry in your book, you remember you are faithful. Every step you never shook, you are with me in the valley. You are with me in the fight. Every tear in your bottle, you will turn them into light. When the world feels heavy and I'm lost in the storm, your love surrounds me gently, and I finally feel warm. every cry in your book. You will turn them into light. In your arms, Lord, I'll look.
What a world we live in. So we left off last week talking about two of the most outlandish things that a Jewish group of leaders could possibly say. And in the heat of their anger and frustration and hatred, they cried out, "We have no king but Caesar," in violation of everything they ever believed and ever stood for and ever taught. And then they cried out, "Let his blood be upon us and upon our children." Pilate washed his hands of it symbolically, but certainly not in reality. I'm afraid that the gesture of washing your hands might look good to the public, but it doesn't do anything between you and God. So we have the statement that is rung down through the ages, and we talked a bit about this last week, and I want to spend a little bit more time on it. I guess just because it's interesting to me and it's something that I've thought about and argued about with myself for a long time. But this statement, "Let his blood be on us and on our children," has been the justification and the excuse for so many atrocities through the years. And as we talk about this morning, it has to be in the clear understanding that you and I have a charge from God, and that charge is that we love everybody always. Our charge from the mouth of Jesus is to love God and to love people. So nothing I say in any way should be interpreted as anti-Semitic or any anti-anyone. We might think, well, we read in the Old Testament, God turned his back on his people many times, and that's true. But you see, he's God, and I'm not. The power that created the universe, called it into existence, and holds it in his hands and breathes life into it, can act justly in all circumstances. But I can't. So my solution is, I love all people always. But here are a few things that we can think about as we think about this, and this is more just from the perspective of historical accounting. Of course, the first thing that we talked about last week, the first thing that comes to mind is the destruction of Jerusalem, which is going to take place just a short time, just 2 or 3 decades after Jesus' resurrection, after his crucifixion. And that will be a turning point in history for the chosen people of God. Up until AD 70, if you had said to a Jew in Jerusalem or in Israel, "What do you think about church and state?" he wouldn't have had an idea of what you were talking about. It would have made no sense to him at all. It was a pure theocracy. The government, the secular, and the religious world were one and the same. The Jewish leaders and ultimately the Sanhedrin was the religious and the secular power. With the destruction of the temple, that went away. And never again in the last 2,000 years have the Jewish people lived under a theocracy. They don't today, even though they have their own country. They're by no means a theocracy. They have a pure secular government, and they have a religious element within that government. But the theocracy itself is gone. Now, does that play into how God's relationship with those people exists? Was that a changing point? Was that a dividing point? I don't know. We mentioned a little bit of this, and I'll just go through it quickly. In the last 2,000 years, the blood curse, let his blood be upon us and upon our children, has been used as an excuse in almost every generation. And for the period leading up to the middle of the 20th century, there are at least 500,000 examples of Jewish people being killed under that excuse. And then, of course, with the rise of Hitler and his devotion and dedication to exterminating the entire race, using again the blood curse as his excuse, he exterminated in the most atrocious way up to another 6 million, perhaps more, of the Jewish people. Complicating this, as we mentioned last week, is Paul's statement in Romans 11. Did God reject his people? By no means. I'm an Israelite myself, a descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin. God did not reject his people. This is being written after Jerusalem's destruction. This is in the Christian era. And this is the leading apostle to the Gentiles saying this. And then in verse 11 he says, again I ask, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? Not at all. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. But if their transgression means riches for the world, and their loss means riches for the Gentiles, how much greater riches will their full inclusion bring? I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in, and in that way all Israel will be saved. As far as the gospel is concerned, they are enemies for your sake, but as far as election is concerned, they are loved on account of the patriarchs, for God's gifts and his call are irrevocable. That adds an entirely different dimension to anything that we may conclude concerning God's relationship with Israel. And it creates some real questions for us to try to understand exactly what Paul is talking about. And this is where we left off last week, and there are three major or primary ways that this is explained or accounted for. And you may have others, and I'll give you an opportunity to share those. There is the ethnic Israel concept. Where all Israel means the Jewish people as a collective, not every single Jew ever, but a significant remnant of the nation as a whole will experience salvation through faith in Jesus at or before history's end. If you took Romans 11 completely standalone, didn't know anything else but that would be a very logical conclusion to come to. You can understand Paul's writing to say exactly that. Before the end of time, Israel will be saved. And when I asked my Messianic Jewish friend in Israel what that passage in Romans 11 meant, that's exactly what he said. Another way of looking at it is the elect remnant. All Israel as the true spiritual remnant of believing Jews throughout history. And we could go to Romans 9 and Romans 11 and see some language to that effect. Already being saved alongside Jews. In other words, all means the complete elect. It's not something that's going to happen in the future. It's something that's happening day by day by day. So when the fullness of the Gentiles arrives, and all of the Jews who are believing Christians will be included in that number. And that's the Israel that will be saved. And then the third one, and this is probably the one that I grew up with, even though this wasn't really ever discussed very much, but I think this was probably where we would have fallen in line, is that the whole discussion here is not about temporal Israel, not about the physical nation of Israel, but it's about spiritual Israel. And spiritual Israel is all of God's people, Jews and Gentiles. And it's all those who are Christ followers, Christ disciples. So thus, he's talking about the Israel of believers. Galatians 6:16, peace and mercy to all who follow this rule, and he calls them the Israel of God. This views the church, spiritual Israel, as fulfilling Israel's role and answering to God's promise to the Israelite people. All right, I know David's chomping at the bits, so we're going to let him go first. Not really?
I actually have a little bit of difficulty with all three of those, to be honest with you, because none of them really, in my mind, fulfill what Paul's saying. I think Paul is really saying that there is going to be a point in time where the Jewish people are going to be adopted back in. But how that's going to happen, we really don't see. And I think back about what Peter said. He said, talking about Paul, he said, some of the things in his writing are hard to understand.
Yes.
But the whole idea, I think the one that comes closest is probably the spiritual Israel, from my understanding. But I do think that there's implication that it goes beyond that.
Anybody else? Come on, Jeff. Well, I want to give you a little factual information about the conditions, just because it's interesting. Go ahead.
This Israelite is coming seriously, like it's coming from your heart, but it's coming for us too, and we need it.
All right. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. We do need it. And one of these days, it's all going to be clear. Just not today.
There was one thing I forgot to mention, that idea about let his blood be upon us and on our children, I think actually had some fulfillment with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, because as you mentioned, that ended the theocracy, and that is really where I think that if there is a curse, which I've never thought of it that way, but if there were such a curse, it was really upon the Jewish leadership, because they were the ones who opposed everything that God had planned.
That's a very important point. Jesus was not killed by the Jews, period. The Romans killed him. He was killed by the insistence and the persuasion of a small group of Jewish leaders. This was not the multitudes that assembled on the Sea of Galilee to listen to him preach, or the multitudes that assembled to eat the loaves and the fishes, or the multitudes that waved the palm leaf fans and put down their garments for him to walk into Jerusalem. They were not the ones that killed Jesus. They're the ones who, on the day of Pentecost, were baptized, the 3,000 plus who were baptized. So that much we can clearly understand and definitively say. I ask, you all know I'm kind of obsessed with artificial intelligence. I'm sorry, you just have to put up with me. So I asked one of the programs, thinking as a theologian and a historian from the time of Moses, the descendants of Israel, of Isaac and the nation of Israel and the Jewish people have arguably been the most persecuted of all people of all times. I think that's probably true. I don't know that I can prove it. But then I asked, why has this been the case? And here are some things that came up. Religious and cultural distinctiveness. Their commitment to monotheism, they lived in a world of polytheistic worship. And the people of the land could never understand monotheism. They were covenantal people. They were defined by their covenant with Yahweh. They were practicing very unique practices that basically set them apart. That made them targets of societies that value conformity. And they were outsiders. All through the history of Israel, that's been the case. Minority status, as a small, often stateless group, Jews were vulnerable to scapegoating during crisis, whether economic, political, or social. Because they were this weird group over there, and in a time and a place where everything that happened was the direct result of the gods plural. Anything that happened where the Jewish people lived was immediately, if it was bad, was immediately blamed on the Jews. Now, that was not true only in the pre-Christ time. It's true in much more modern times. And during the medieval period, for example, when the Black Death came along and took out, I don't know what, half of Europe almost, who got blamed? The Jews got blamed. And that was an excuse to have them driven out or executed. From a theological perspective, both Jewish and non-Jewish religious frameworks sometimes interpreted Jewish suffering in ways that justified or perpetuated hostility. This is the blood curse. They said, let his blood be upon us. Okay, we're going to punish them for that, for all eternity. The adaptability and resilience. Ironically, the Jewish people's ability to survive and thrive in adverse conditions may have intensified perceptions of them as a distinct or influential group, feeding cycles of resentment. They have always been a very small minority wherever they are in the diaspora throughout the world, and yet they've been very, very influential. Even in places and countries and times when they were not allowed to do most things, there was a tendency to give them responsibility in financial activities, primarily because they were very good at it. But even though they were given those responsibilities, they were also resented for them. They were hated because they were successful. So those are some of the things from a fairly technical perspective that a historian might look at to try to explain the phenomena of their having been persecuted. This is another way of stating it, maybe a little bit easier. Their distinctiveness and social separation, their weird practices of the Sabbath, the dietary laws, they all were interpreted as putting them as aloof. We're better than you, and they were hated for that. Scapegoating, we mentioned that. Economic factors, blame for every catastrophe. Religious antagonism, of course, from the very beginning, there was a tension between the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians. This is all the way back into the New Testament. And Paul, of course, had to come to Rome and have a meeting with the apostles and the leaders. That was in Rome, and Acts 15, to try to smooth out some of that tension. But that idea has persisted, and that was the root of the atrocities that were carried out in the name of Christianity during some of the Crusades. The Crusades were originally conceived with the idea of going to Israel and freeing the Holy Land of the Muslim influence. The First Crusade did that and was fairly successful, and there are still a lot of building remnants from that period of time that the Crusades did. But the latter Crusades, and there were about 7 of them, didn't have any success in doing that, and they turned their spears and their swords against the Jewish people. Of course, the Spanish Inquisition, you could, if you were a Jew in Spain during the Inquisition, you had 2 choices. You could convert to Christianity or you could die. So that tension has persisted through the ages. Nationalism and modern anti-Semitism, they are scattered throughout the world, and until the middle of the 20th century, they didn't even have a homeland at all. And they were always considered to be outsiders. And then when they did, because England was divesting itself of its colonialism, and they chose to give the land of Israel back to the Jews, well, of course, that was just a powder keg. And that created the tension and the hatred that has raged since then on a daily and hourly basis in the Middle East, and continues today as headlines today, as you know. That conflict between the Middle East, the Muslim nation, and the Jewish people. What's extraordinary, I believe, is the endurance. Empires that oppressed them, going all the way back to Egypt and Babylon. We could mention Persia, Syria, Rome, more recently Nazi Germany. All of those are gone. They're gone. And the Jewish nation continues. Historically, this is due to strong cultural cohesion, family-centered life, commitment to Hebrew Scripture and tradition. And that has held them together as more than just a bloodline. Theologically, according to Jeremiah 30:11, it's God's providence. Jeremiah says, I will not make a full end of you, and he hasn't. Since Israel is no longer a theocracy, not even in Israel, is God's covenant with the nation, or only with that segment that are still observant of the law of Moses? This was an interesting thing that I had on my mind, and I've there's no longer a theocracy, and even though there is now a country of Israel, who's God covenant with? God made covenants throughout Hebrew Scripture with the Israel people. If that covenant still exists, who's it with? Is it with the Israel nation? Or is it with that very small group of people within the Israel nation who still are pretending like they're keeping the law of Moses? They can't keep the law of Moses because they don't have a temple. But they have found ways to substitute for the temple and for the sacrificial system. God's covenant, as understood in Hebrew Scripture, is with the Jewish people, Israel, as a collective, not solely with those observant of the law of Moses. The modern state of Israel's secular nature does not negate its covenantal significance as a partial fulfillment of the promise of the land, but the covenant extends beyond the state to all Jews regardless of observance. Now, that's not my opinion. That's the opinion of Jewish rabbis. In rabbinical thought today, God's covenant still exists, not only with the country of Israel, not only with the segment of Jews in the world who are still making an attempt at being observant, but with anybody who is of Jewish blood. Jewish tradition affirms that all Jews, observant or not, are included in the covenantal relationship due to their shared identity and descent. The absence of a theocracy in the Temple Mount's current state suggests that the covenant's full realization awaits further divine or human action. Yet God's faithfulness to Israel as a people endures, embracing both the observant and the non-observant within the collective destiny of the nation. Again, that's not my conclusion. That's the teaching and the understanding of the rabbinical Jewish people today. The Jewish people as a whole still reject Jesus as the promised Messiah. Total worldwide Messianic Jewish population is between 300 and 500,000. That's a big range. That's because it's hard to count. It's really difficult to come up with a number for that because in some places it's not very safe to admit that you are a Messianic Jew. With a world population of about 2.5 billion Christians, roughly 1 in every 3 people in the world name the name of Christ. If we take a number between 300 and 500,000, we'll just say arbitrarily 400,000 Messianic Jews, then that segment represents 0.016% of the Christian nation. So if the full measure of the Jewish population is going to come to Christ, they've got a long way to go. There's going to be a major revival somewhere, David. There are approximately 15.8 million people who identify as Jewish in the world. Almost half of them live in Israel. 46% of them. There are approximately 350,000 Messianic Jews in the world. This is 2.2% of the Jews. Perhaps as many as 15,000 live in Israel. That would mean about 2% of the Israelis are Messianic Jews. I think that number may be a little high. From my time in Israel, it's not comfortable to be a Messianic Jew in Israel today. All right, that's more than you ever wanted to know about the Jewish situation, but I found it interesting.
Just a few thoughts. One, thinking about the history and scripture of the Israel nation. God keeps his promises regardless of their status. You know, they totally fall away, but he's still their God. And so from one respect, you could think, okay, well, maybe God is still blessing Israel, but it would be an example and an encouragement to us of the steadfastness of God to his people, being all those who serve him. The other thing that came to mind was that Jesus said himself that no one comes to the Father except through Christ. So there's that aspect also, that for salvation in our afterlife, if you will, we need that comes through Christ himself. And then the third thought I had, well, first of all, I'm glad I'm not God because I don't understand any of this stuff. But
Me too.
To interpret the verses in Romans, I think you have to understand why Paul wrote the book. I've got some vague memories of that, but I think you alluded to the fact that in Rome there was a lot of division between Jews and Gentiles and that sort of thing. So as I recall, the book was written primarily to bring these groups of people back together. And so we have to interpret these hard verses in that light, as opposed to trying to state some sort of theological statement or doctrine of some sort of that nature, from my opinion.
Yeah, those are good thoughts. Yeah, he was writing to Rome because apparently there had been some attitudes expressed that were not Christian, and maybe the Gentiles were saying, well, we're more holy than you, or we're better or more important than you. And Paul was addressing that attitude in part of his writings in Romans 11. I was real concerned about, or interested in, not concerned, but interested in when the temple was destroyed, sacrificial system went away. The sacrificial system was the ways that the Jews appropriated forgiveness. They had all of their different sacrifices that were a way of appeasing God for their sins. They could no longer offer animal sacrifice. Haven't been able to since AD 70. So how do they continue to function as a religious organization? How do they, absent the blood of Jesus, which they deny as being the means of salvation, how do they approach God about their sins? And I found an answer to that. I'll let you discuss it first, and then I'll correct it.
Well, you know, this isn't the first time in Jewish history they were not allowed to sacrifice. Under the Babylonian captivity that happened, and their solution to that was captured by Paul when he said, present your bodies as a living sacrifice. That was Paul's statement, but it wasn't unique to him. That was what the Jewish people decided, that a living sacrifice would be acceptable to God in place of the sacrifices they were no longer able to make. Now, again, the way they interpret it and the way we interpret it are probably quite different, but the point is that that's how they justify not having the ability to do animal sacrifice.
Yeah, well, right, and the rabbis are very specific about the new sacrifice. They can't do the old sacrifice, right? So what is the new sacrifice? It's three things. Reading Torah. Reading Torah is considered a sacrifice. The other one is prayer. And the third one is good deeds. So all of it is works, which of course is consistent with Hebrew practice anyway. But by reading Torah, by prayer and righteous living, if you will, and by good deeds, that becomes your animal sacrifice in today's Judaism. And that's from the rabbis, not from me. All right, so Pilate decided to grant their demand. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one they asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will. Of course, that's Barabbas. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. What do we know about Barabbas? Not a lot. Matthew 27:16 describes him as a notorious prisoner. Mark and Luke both name him as an insurrectionist and a murderer, and John calls him a robber. The guy had a bad rap sheet. He was not a good dude, but they preferred him over Jesus. There are some manuscripts that suggest his full name may have been Jesus Barabbas. Barabbas, of course, is Bar Abba, which is son of the Father. If that's true, it's kind of a ironic thing, but we have two Jesuses. We have one who is guilty of everything and one who is completely innocent, and the one that they put to death is the innocent one. It reminds us a little bit of the scapegoat during Yom Kippur. You remember they took the innocent goat out and killed it and confessed the sins of the people over it, and it took on the guilt of the people so that the guilty could go free. The innocent died so the guilty could go free. In Acts 3:14, Peter rebukes the crowd, saying they ask for a murderer to be granted to you, underscoring the injustice and the spiritual blindness of the moment. Carrying his own cross, he went out. Well, we're going to come now to what's called the Via Dolorosa, the Way of the Cross. We're going to see Jesus going out from the courtyard of Pilate on his way to a hill called Golgotha. And there are going to be some women there who are going to be weeping and mourning. And we're going to come across a guy named Simon from the country of Cyrene. And then we're going to come up to the mountain and see him laid on the cross and have the nails driven in his hands and feet. And that's a discussion for next Sunday, Lord willing. Well, I'm sorry I took so much time on the Jewish issue. I hope I wasn't terribly boring for you. It was just something that was on my mind, and I'd done some research on it, and so I thought if I had to go through it, you might as well too. So have a wonderful God bless week.